Hey everyone, today I thought I would continue this conversation around issues of metamodern Christianity and what that looks like and how we make sense of these interesting questions as it comes to relate with the whole notion of metamodernism and metamodernity, and wanted to offer my take on a particular angle of this issue, which has to do with history and religion. I think some of the feedback or some of the responses to the stuff I've been saying in conversations with folks like Paul Vanderklay and others has landed for some people as a sense of me as kind of a modern historicizing thinker that just wants to kind of look at the Gospels and the religious tradition and view it through the lens of modern history, and people have a kind of sense of in a sense, kind of justified consternation at that because religion isn't just about history, and there's a lot more going on there. And so I think some people are under the misconception that I'm trying to reduce these kinds of topics to just sort of modern historical critical things. So I wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit and clarify a bit what I'm really gesturing towards. And I won't frame this so much already because I already have in other videos, and I'll link them in terms of what I mean by metamodern spirituality and metamodern Christianity is something that integrates, pre-modern, modern, postmodern, et cetera, and a synergistic third thing that comes from all this. So I won't explain all that, but I will just zoom in on this issue of the issue of history and how I think it can be optimally navigated, and then I'll maybe talk a little bit about how we might also be in danger of stumbling over this issue of history. Um, so for me, let me be clear. I'm not trying to make everything about history. What I am trying to do is gesture towards how a metamodern Christianity can move beyond history. But I feel like to do that requires first going through the historical and the historicizing moment. Um, and that is, I think, the necessary sort of movement that needs to take place, right? That there is a kind of prehistorical to historical to what you could call a transhistorical lens on well, Christianity, but more broadly just the spiritual life in general. And I wanted to kind of, yeah, unpack this a little bit because I see this as a kind of almost kind of quintessential meta modern move that has examples from across different aspects of the kind of meta modern conversation, from the cultural studies stuff you see it showing up and into the developmental stuff and all that. So I wanted to you know say more what this movement looks like to me and what I'm really trying to gesture towards by foregrounding the historical, because it's not about ending with the historical, it's about moving through and beyond the historical. So one way of thinking about that is that, the quote unquote historical Jesus is a way for us to actually move through that conception to what you could call the transhistorical Christ. Um, the Jesus of history versus the Christ of faith, and all this can be conceived in ways that are sort of developmental in their unfolding, that one thing builds on the other, and you can move through particular lenses and ways of looking at things in a way that accrete and build on themselves, and enrich your conception of reality, but also push you more towards like a bit more paradoxical and mystical relationships to the subject matter, which I think, rightly, when people are hung up on this issue of history, that's probably what they're getting hung up on, is that this isn't just about history. And here's the key: is that um, there's a classic danger in committing what can be called what Ken Wilber calls the pre-trans fallacy, which is that, on either side of a thing, pre the thing and post the thing, you're not that thing, right? But we can confuse and conflate what's on either side of those poles. For example, people talk about post-secularity. In fact, this was a question I got in one of the comments to one of my videos. How is metamodernism different from post-secularity? But like post-secularity is an interesting term, right? So to be post-secular, you have to have first moved through the secular. You have to have, moved into secularity and fully gotten that to then have moved beyond it. Um, and yet, uh, presuming that there is some element of a return to religion and spirituality in a post-secular context, that's going to look similar to how a pre-secular context might look, where religion dominates and there isn't secularity. So how do we distinguish between things like pre-secularity and post-secularity, or you could say trans-secularity, right? So this is a whole like aspect of the pre-trans issue, which is inherently kind of a developmental sequential issue. And another way of thinking about it, right, is that postmodernism is moving beyond the modern rational frame. So does that mean that we don't just kind of reduce things to rationality? Well, yeah, we kind of take in more than that. We'd have a broader conception than that. So we're not just being rational, but you can also be pre-modern and be not just rational. So the pre-modern context winds up having superficial similarities with a postmodern context or frame, and we need to be able to adjudicate the difference between these. And I think that a lot of the confusion around this issue around history and its importance and significance gets kind of caught up with this issue, which is like, what's the role of history? What's the role of modern thought and rationality and science and evidence and all this stuff when it comes to religion and Christianity? Because people rightly are acknowledging that, that's not the total frame. And so that could be pointing towards a postmodern Christianity or eventually a metamodern Christianity. But at the same time, and this is the danger that we're seeing across the board in politics and other places as well, people might be trying to use notions of post to actually just justify their take on the pre, meaning they haven't even engaged with the secular or the modern or the rational, but they want to find a kind of linguistic way to justify that as being, the new thing. And so they'll call it post or trans or whatever, right? So this is the issue. A lot of people watching this will be familiar with this kind of classic pre-trans fallacy, as Ken Wilber calls it. And I think it's a really valuable uh, tool for analyzing and assessing issues in a progressive developmental sense. So presuming that there is a metamodern Christianity that has moved beyond the modern and the postmodern, how do we make sure that this isn't just some kind of regressive or reactionary turn to a pre-modern style traditional form of Christianity? And that seems to be the hangup right now at the moment, is trying to adjudicate just that. Because some folks in the conversation space around this issue of metamodern Christianity want to center certain forms of Christian discourse that, to my ears anyway, land very much as sort of pre-modern traditional devotional. And they want to say that this is metamodern. And then the question is, well, how and why, right? And now the key to all this is that to recognize something as being genuinely post or trans on the other side of this thing and not just before it, it has to somehow include some element of that or work through something about it. It has to be deeply familiar with it and engaged it, identified with it at some point. And there's a sense that all of this somehow is worked through so that you're actually genuinely going beyond it rather than just sidestepping it or even being, anti it or whatever it is. So, for example, if you want to say that what you're talking about is trans-rational, really the only way of assessing whether or not that's a legitimate claim is if someone can actually perform at a rational level of analysis as well. That doesn't mean that that's where they stop or that that's the be all end all, but they have to show proficiency and kind of capacity at the level of the rational before any claims about trans rationality can be taken seriously, right? I can't be a black belt if I haven't been a yellow belt first. So I've got to do the moves at being a yellow belt and show proficiency and capacity at that before I can, claim that I'm a black belt. And yet, that's a very simplistic example, but in these sorts of instances where you're talking about paradigm shifts and different ways of thinking, and you're talking about worldviews changing and this sort of a thing, and moving beyond even potentially rationality, there's got to be, these are ways in which the whole structure gets shifted. And so it's really key that if we're going to be framing things in those terms, that there needs to be a demonstrated, familiarity, proficiency, and capacity with the given frame that it is claimed to have transcended. And there are deeper ways that this can be assessed. And Jason Storm's work is really cool, talking about metamodernism as he uses some like Hegelian language of negation of the negation, and some of that kind of more classic dialectical stuff to show how you can actually use certain ideas of a particular frame and sort of radicalize them to get to a further level, and in a way that actually winds up, undermining kind of the logic of the previous stage, but getting you to a whole new stage that is a movement forward by means of the previous thing. I talk a lot about that in the book that I wrote, Metamodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics, and that to me is like the crucial framing for metamodernism. Whatever metamodernism is has to move through and beyond postmodernism by means of postmodernism. And to have gotten to something genuinely postmodern, you have to be doing at least, the modern thing and get that and have worked through that, and so on and so forth, right? So, the Iranian theocracy is not postmodern because it's not modern. It's pre-modern in orientation because it isn't even grappling with the sort of issues of, the modern world and universal human rights and, a democratic society and, rational governance and all this kind of stuff, right? So just because something isn't one thing doesn't mean that it's post or trans that thing. It can be pre that thing. It can be, it hasn't even fully engaged with that. And so what does all this have to do with history and religion? Well, the claim I guess I want to make is that if you're going to explore the notion that a metamodern Christianity is, let's say, not hung up with the issues of historicity and the historical critical method that you get from the modern scientific method, um, it has to at least show proficiency and capacity with that frame, even if it's going to ultimately transcend it, right? So a good tell or sign that like that hasn't happened is if people say, well, this is metamodern Christianity, because it doesn't give any credence to the whole historical critical stuff at all, because that stuff is dumb and it's hubristic and nonsense or whatever, right? That's sort of like, that probably doesn't engage with very deeply with the historical critical method at all. It just sort of sidesteps it. And so any attempt then to say that it is beyond it is just sort of, undermined by the very fact that it has not moved through it. It has not yet encountered it. So that's kind of the basic frame I want to work with here. And I want to explore metamodern Christianity from this lens, because I think that we can meaningfully talk about a prehistorical to a historical to a transhistorical progression through the Christian mythos in a way that can be really revealing about the importance of history, but also the limits of history. And I think this will shed a little bit of light on what it is that I'm trying to do by foregrounding and emphasizing the historical critical material, because it's only a movement in the sort of dialectical series. It's only a part or a portion of the kind of journey of the evolution of the Christian story and of spirit and of God more broadly. So that's the kind of basic claim I want to make here. And this can, I think, resolve a lot of, important issues, which is that I think a lot of people, in realizing kind of maybe even intuitively that modern historical critical scholarship is not the culmination or the be all end all of the religious life, and in fact has a, in many ways, kind of deleterious impact on faith and devotion and all that, for probably obvious reasons. But that it doesn't need to end there, that things can move beyond it, right? People who recognize that get that we have to do something different than just what history is naming about these sources and these texts and who the historical Jesus was. But I think that they're confusing that insight with a transhistorical perspective when they conflate it with the insights of a prehistorical perspective, meaning that a lot of people want to then turn to sort of traditional, devotional, pre-modern forms of Christianity with its various kinds of literalism and fundamentalism of various stripes, um, and say that this is somehow gesturing to something beyond the modern historical critical, when in fact it's just not yet historical critical. And maybe I'm repeating myself like a broken record at this point, but I want to make the point clear. We can get to, and hopefully can, will get to and should get to exploring what a trans historical perspective on the Christian mythos is, but that requires moving through it. So one of the points I want to make is that the Gospels, for example, are not historical documents. And again, this will be emphasized by people who are also maybe more sympathetic to what I would call the prehistorical, because they would heartily agree. They would say you're missing the point if you're trying to read, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as history. That's not what it's about, and that's true. But I think we need to be clear about why that's true. It's not, I would posit, as some would, that these are transcendent mystical texts or mythological documents that are operating at a psychoactive level to shape your worldview through like this new lens that will transform you in some, way that is like uh rather mystical in terms of its insight and profundity and the genius that would go into the production of these texts and the inspiration that would be required to achieve an effect like that, that all this kind of is what these texts were intentionally about and doing from the beginning, and how we must understand them. I don't think that's right at all. I think that, and this will be a bitter pill maybe for some who want to go that route, I think we need to appreciate that the Gospels are prehistorical, that they're not historical because they are literally chronologically before the invention of history. And so what I mean by that, in part, well, the big thing that I mean by that is that history was invented. It's a genre. It's a way of recounting events that did not always exist, and it is the product of a particular worldview and a cognitive set of capacities that allow us to articulate events in a particular way, and that way of talking about events is not a kind of timeless universal, but that you can actually identify points in, let's say, because I want to say history, right? But what I mean is in the chronology of events that have occurred over time, the development of historiography has been a part of those events, and so you can go back in time and identify texts that were written very early, and they don't conform to historical standards by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and then you can go forward through time, and you can begin to see the clarification of what historical texts are and what they should be, and certain criteria for this and that. Um, to the point where you come all the way to the present, and now we have history sections in our bookstores and our libraries, and people can study not just history but the writing of history and the criteria behind what makes good historical work, and how do you write good history, and what are the methods of proper historiography and art, archival work, and all, evidentiary, primary, secondary sources, all that stuff, right? um that stuff didn't exist back in time. If you go back to like even the ancient Roman period, that was not how people recounted events, mostly. And certainly, if you go all the way back to, I don't know, early agricultural civilizations like Sumer or Ur, or, you know, um, ancient Babylon or Syria or what have you. That's not how they did it then. If you wanted to look at history then, you'd find a stela or like a monument, and the king would say, "I am so great, and I conquered this person, and they're awful and ridiculous, and I destroyed them, and I took all their, booty and bounty, and enriched myself, and I'm just the greatest person there ever was." And that is how stories about things that happened in time, went down. Um, Today, we would do it very differently. So the point is, history um, is not a given, right? It's an invented category. It's a social construct, you could say, but it's a social construct with a lot of good validation and justification to it. Uh, you could say from a rational perspective. Point being, history is not a given. It's not a universal category. It's the product of a particular set of kind of cognitive developments and ways of making sense of reality that come online at a certain point in kind of the chronology of the human species and our culture, and that marks a meaningful distinction point between sort of ways of accounting for phenomena that then take up the historical method versus ways that didn't in previous times before. The Gospels are examples of texts that are prehistorical. They're not trying to be a genre that didn't exist yet. And so, again, people who want to emphasize that point for various reasons are right to do so, but we should understand the implications of that on its own terms. And I think that it's important, but again, also challenging to embrace this idea for its full significance because it strikes at the heart of some of our natural biases and desires for a kind of uh, primacy and primordial nature to ultimate truth. We want to posit that what is ultimately true has a kind of pedigree of ancient wisdom and can be traced back to origins. And there's a nature of sort of the fallacy of origins in this that we want to ascribe to the generative seminal aspects of a particular idea, the fullness and the completeness of that idea. And if we are taking evolutionary ways of understanding seriously, we know how problematic that is, right? Newton was an alchemist. He was part of a tradition of unfolding and changing notions of what science itself was. So if we want to go back to Newton as being, the first scientist or something, or Galileo as being the first scientist, we'll be sorely disappointed, right? If we're looking for our current conception of the ideal scientist in the original form, because actually the original form is going to be closest to the form that came before it. And it's going to be the least like what we might conceive of as the ideal scientist, because it's going to be so much like the other things that we now define science against. Let's just say, to use an example, but this occurs all over the place. When it comes to religion, right? People always want to find the fullness of the insight of their tradition in the seminal text itself, in scripture. They want to go back and say, there it all is, there's the fullness of it. I would say they're looking for the transhistorical in the prehistorical, that they're trying to retroactively find in the text or the tradition that which has subsequently been revealed from and unfolded from and flowered from the tradition. And that's problematic. We don't look for the flower in the seed, right? You can say in a kind of loose poetic way that the seed contains the flower, but also not really, right? You need time and material and everything to unfold in order to get that. And if we're going to take that unfolding seriously, if we're going to take development seriously, going to take learning seriously, then we have to acknowledge that things change over time from, in some senses, less to more full, from kind of cruder to more complete or sophisticated or refined or enriched. And this can be a real stumbling block for folks, especially if they're coming from, versions of Christianity that place a lot of emphasis on the fundamentals and the primacy of scripture and the tradition, etc., especially as notions of like inspiration, that it was sort of like all there from the beginning already. And I won't say much more about that because that's its own topic and not the main thing I want to emphasize here. But I think that that is the kind of psychological aspect that goes into a lot of the hangups around this issue. But if we can appreciate that the Gospels are prehistorical and not history because they are before the level of history itself, and not try to make them more than what they are, we can allow ourselves to move into the historical perspective and beyond it, without unnecessarily retroactively reading that back into the past. And that is the move I want to describe, because I think it's a very metamodern move, and the one that I think needs to be made. So how does this work? You know, one example I could give is like my name is Brendan Graham Dempsey, and all of those names are very Irish in nature. And I grew up thinking that I was mostly Irish. Um, it's not at all conceivable that that could have led me to adopt a lot of Irish identity traditions, and kind of frame my sense of myself through this heritage. Maybe that could have been something that was very important. As it kind of happened, it wasn't so much, but let's just say that it did. Let's say I got really into my Irish roots, and I'm Brendan Graham Dempsey, and I went looking into the Dempsey clan and all this stuff in Ireland, and I tried to find all that. Um, well, here's the thing: I did a DNA test a couple years ago, and it turns out I am not Irish at all. That's just my name, and turns out I'm actually more like I have a lot of Scottish heritage and sort of Northern Europe and that sort of a thing. Some European Jew. I'm got a mixture of things in there, but no Irish. Now here's the thing, right? And this is kind of the crux of the issue. I've now moved from sort of a naive, pre-scientific notion of my heritage into a kind of informed, scientific, objective, evidentiary-based view of my heritage. How does that change how I relate to my heritage? How does that change, the traditions that I'm a part of? If I had been celebrating St. Patrick's Day in a kind of religious sense, let's just say, to use that word in all of its connotations, for many, many years, and I'd gotten deep into my Irish identity, do I now have to abandon all of that because it turns out I'm mostly Scottish? Gosh, what if I'd been mostly English and I was a sort of historical enemy of my people, right? I mean, what sort of impact does this have? So the reality of history is now confronting me. What do I do with that? And the case that I want to make is that the history in that sense doesn't matter relative to the traditional way that I have been living. If I've found a home and a meaning in Irish heritage, and then my history winds up not supporting that narrative, I don't think that then I need to abandon my sense of myself for the history. The history almost doesn't matter at that point. It's because it's not, my identity is not about the history. The history was just sort of the means for developing a particular identity. But the identity is now real. And the history is in some ways very not real, to the degree that it impinges in any direct way on what traditions I celebrate and the way that I conceive of myself. This is the sort of movement that I want to suggest is possible with how we relate to historicity and the Gospels. People might balk at this, and that particular example might become problematic, especially once you start getting into marginalized identities and different forms of ethnicity that maybe so. I'm just trying to use this as an example, right? And take it for what it's worth. There are many other ways that we could talk about this. Let's say you grew up and you thought you were an only child, right? And then you find a Facebook groups of being an only child and this and that. I don't know. And then over the years, eventually you find out that actually you have a twin brother or sister somewhere. And how does that change then your identity? Well, it doesn't. It actually has no impact whatsoever on this whole thing that you've been a part of. Because why? Because it's purely a proposition at that point. It's purely just a claim. And it's a claim with great evidentiary support. So we should affirm it as history and as being real and important. But in terms of the ways that it would impinge on my self identity and how I live in the world, it need make no claim on any of that because that's not propositional. That's participatory, if you want to think about that in sort of Vervaekian terms. Um, uh, the way that I am in the world and the sense I make of myself is is not beholden simply to what may or may not have happened in the past, right? It's beholden to what I do in the present um with my time and my my way of thinking and the way that I show up in the world and the kinds of ways that my sense of who I am gets impacted and shifted and changed by my behavior, you could say. Um, and this is, I think, is an important way of thinking about the role that history can be informing, but also transcended. Once I learn that I'm not Irish from my DNA test, I need to integrate that reality. I can't just ignore it. I can't just say, "Oh, that was a bad test." If I found the right test, it would show that I'm actually Irish. I don't need to do that. I can say, "Oh, that's interesting. I'm actually not Irish." Okay, well, that's what my DNA says, but dot dot dot. Um, and I think we can do something very similar and need to do something very similar with notions of historicity and the Gospels and Jesus and the tradition, um, which is to say, we can become familiar with the facts and then we can say, oh, that's interesting. That's important. I hear that and I acknowledge it as being historically the case, but doesn't impact whether I go to church or whether I, read the Gospels in a devotional way, etc. Because that's not about propositional claims in the same way. It's a participatory way of being in the world through engagement with a particular worldview and mythos and set of symbols and ideas that actively changes me to be a certain kind of person in the world. And none of that is affected by the history, so to speak. Um, you know, I think this is the key, and I think it's important that we could engage the seriousness of a Christianity that actually could acknowledge the possibility that Jesus never even existed and could still feel totally justified to do what it does. I mean, for the record, historically speaking, Jesus very likely did exist as a person, and that's not the point that I'm trying to make. I'm trying to suggest that the history can be acknowledged for what it is and yet transcended because it's not about the historical Jesus that Christianity is what it is. It's about the transhistorical Christ. It's about the Christ of faith. It's about the symbols and the tradition. It's about the liturgy. It's about the praxis. It's about the community. It's about how people live their lives in light of certain ideals and values and framing perspectives. That's what uh, that's what it's about. That's what Christianity can be, right? And it can be those things, even as the history is something totally different. And that's the kind of maybe difficult thing for some people to really acknowledge because some people will just get hung up with, well, if it didn't actually happen, then and that's its own thing and that's its own form of Christianity, but that's a kind of mythic literal form of Christianity. And that's a form of Christianity that will have to look at the modern historical critical insights and just brush them aside and just say, that's all nonsense. What a metamodern Christianity would do is say, that's true, that's real, that's actual, that happened, that is the best historical account of the situation. Uh, and we do this other thing called metamodern Christianity in relationship to a Christ of faith and a symbol and a conception of the divine that none of that really impinges on in any meaningful way. And for so many people, that's going to be such a huge hang up. And I get that. But that's the move, the only move I can see as being a genuine possibility for a genuine metamodern Christianity. One that has moved from the prehistorical naivete to the historical informed state, and then into a informed naivete of the metamodern Christian view. And it needs also, by the way, the insights of postmodernity in order to make sense of the fact that the historical frame is a limited frame and not the totality. And it needs the postmodern view to say that, yes, actually, there's worldviews and structuring systemic natures to the organization of our knowledge and our value and our thinking that goes into all this. And we should take that very seriously as well. The difference is that it acknowledges the modern historical critical insights, and it just doesn't end there. If you want to affirm a form of Christianity that you want to call metamodern, but say that Jesus physically rose from the dead, or physically exorcised demons, or raised people from the dead, or walked on water, or calmed storms, or any number of those kinds of phenomena that are talked about in the text, and reject the naturalism of modernity in the process, and reject the insights of source criticism, and say, no, actually, these are entirely, believable, verifiable eyewitness accounts, and just not do any acknowledgement of the modern historical critical method. If you want that kind of Christianity, that is totally available. It's just not metamodern. It's just not engaging with modernity in a sufficient way that shows that it's moved through modernity, right? It has to somehow say, oh, this story was prehistorical, in which Jesus is depicted as calming the raging sea waters for theological and spiritual significance as a message to talk about the fact that God is in control and you can have faith and this sort of a thing. If you want to say that happened as history, there's a category confusion going on there that is actually not taking seriously the full context of the development of human knowledge over time. It's not taking seriously the fact that this is not meant to be history. And it's not taking seriously the relationship to, let's say, the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern in a way that sufficiently shows that it has integrated those successive movements to be able to transcend the regard for the historical insight. So that is not a kind of metamodern move. A metamodern move says, historically speaking, that didn't happen. That's prehistorical material that has a theological motivation and is not of the genre of history. It's a meaningful story. It's a profound story, but it didn't happen in historical time in the way that people say things happen in historical time. And it is true. And that paradox is not confusing. It's very profound and insightful. And that is the sort of Christianity that I think would suggest a metamodern sensibility. And now I mentioned at the outset, that you see parts of this showing up in the cultural metamodernism as well. This isn't just, the developmental stuff. This is metamodern in the sense that, when cultural studies people talk about that term, they're referring to the same phenomenon. There's a whole essay on the Lego movie as being a metamodern film. And one of the things in that movie is that there's this prophecy, And then it turns out that that prophecy was just made up and not real. But it turned out that that prophecy informed someone's actions in such a way that if that prophecy hadn't existed, then they wouldn't have done certain things, and then the prophecy wouldn't have been fulfilled, right? So there's a kind of irony in the fact that it is both made up but also true. It's a social construction, but one that's real, and it's one that's real in a way that changes people's behavior and actually makes it real, because without it, uh, people wouldn't be who they are and do what they do. So there's a kind of profound, mysterious reality sometimes to the fact that certain, uh, using this word loosely for the second, fictions that can create realities by means of their fictionality, and in the process show that they're not fictions. Um, this is a theme in a lot of sort of more metamodern oriented perspectives. The Life of Pi, another film that is, was is a kind of quintessentially metamodern or performatist film, in like Raoul Eshelman's analysis of it. The whole story is this, right? Did did the character go on this magical, mystical journey with a tiger and all this, right? Or did he just end up in a lifeboat and then, had to resort to cannibalism and then made up the story? What's the better story? Um, the issue is like, what do we mean by, yes, the real, but not in a way that negates the fact that that historical thing happened, right? In the Life of Pi, it is the case, historically speaking, that all of that terrible stuff occurred. But that's not the whole story. And sometimes, a lot of the time, we need to reframe the story according to its meaningful significance and how we tell it and how that impacts the way that we live in the world. And that's the better story. And we don't need to pretend like the history didn't happen. We just know that uh, it's not all about the history. Um, and so, to use the example of that film, I think a lot of people, through the more traditional devotional lens, want to say that no, he actually went in a lifeboat with the tiger and all of that actually happened. That's the history. That also is real. And it's like, you don't have to do that part. You can just say that the history is a different thing, and it's actually not what really matters so much, right? Well, it doesn't matter from that lens, from the lens of what's the meaning of the story, what's the significance of it, like, so goes it with God, is how he concludes, right? Like, God is the better story. um and in so being, God is made real, because without God, uh then what, I guess you could say. And there's a big push in this direction that I think people intuitively get. A lot of this speaking about religion for its utility's sake comes from this perspective. It's like, I don't really know if this is actually real or true or historical, but it makes me a better person. And then it's like, if it makes you a better person, then it's real it's connecting with reality in a real way. But let's be clear about how it does that. It doesn't mean that those things actually happened. It means that you're plugging into a different aspect of reality that that story speaks to, but doesn't speak to historically. We can jettison the historical criterion for something's realness. And I guess, just to say it again, we don't need it. We don't need to make the claim that this really happened. We can live the Christian story and say that Jesus was actually just an apocalyptic prophet, in historically speaking, who, didn't do a lot of the things that are attributed to him. Now that's going to land so hard for some people, and that for other people it's going to be like, well, yeah, of course. So if that lands really hard for you and you say, well, then it's not Christianity, or then it's not real, or whatever, like, just sit with that and think about it. Like, just try to grapple with how you might live a Christian life from the perspective of, let's say, the guy Jesus of Nazareth was maybe even a violently minded, political rebel. Maybe that's the case. Does it matter? Batman, the Chris Nolan, right? Christopher Nolan adaptation of the whole Batman story and the whole Dark Knight. It's another motif of this, right? Like Batman has to play the figure that he's not in order to achieve a certain end. That there's a sense that like certain stories play certain roles, and what's important about them isn't whether or not they're historically accurate, it's about the consequence that they have for society and et cetera, et cetera. That's a very insightful and provocative and profound idea. It's a dangerous idea, it can be abused. But there's something going on here, and there's something very metamodern going on here in the cultural zeitgeist about this realization that it's not about the history, it's not about what actually happened, it's about the significance of things, it's about the meaning to them. And this is the genuine outgrowth of postmodern thinking, right? Postmodern thinking comes along and it's like, how do we know anything? How do we know what we know? Maybe we don't know anything. And that's kind of where it stops. And then the metamodern, early metamodern thought is sort of, well, we got to say something. We got to live from somewhere. So, maybe it's not true, but it's the best we can do. And so we'll move in that direction. And again, this is a different part of the metamodern discourse, but it points you in the same direction. It's not about the historical realness of a thing. It's about its consequence, its utility, its significance, and these other things. At the very least, it's an expanding of the sense of the real to appreciate all of its other implications. But crucially, it's not trying to retroactively make the historical anything more than it is. It's not trying to say this actually happened. It's admitting it didn't happen and then saying, let's still believe it anyway. That's the kind of metamodern move that I think we need to take seriously. Hansi Freinacht has written about this, right? Like, you have to get the sense that there isn't magic before you can actually do metamodern magic. And then ironically, you can actually do metamodern magic, but it takes you understanding that it doesn't work the way that magical thinking tends to think it works. You've got to deconstruct the idea before you can reconstruct it and find yourself on the other side of it. And so if you're not taking seriously the history for what it is and how different it is from the prehistorical, you're never going to get to the transhistorical. You're never going to be able to get to the mystical elements of a life of faith and mystery and paradox and the kind of conjunctive faith that Fowler talks about. If you're not able to do this dialectical dance and hold these different modes of the real simultaneously and allow for this uncertainty and allow for the possibility of all these different ways of being to be the case, and not trying to force one particular mode of the real onto everything, that's, I guess, all I want to get at. And I feel that this conversation is coming into view for people. It's just not quite there yet. And so a lot of people have made the mistaken conclusions about a lot of this. They get that history isn't everything. They get that there are different modes of the real. Even Jonathan Pageau and Paul Vanderklay are talking about that. They get that. But the mistake comes in when they also want to say that it actually happened. And that's the problem. If we can say that there are modes of the real, the historical is one of them. We can say what the historical probably was and how radically different and actually rather disenchanting and disappointing maybe it is compared to the prehistorical. And then say, but then there's this other mode of the real in which none of that really matters because we have the idea still of the person of Christ from the full richness of the tradition. And whether or not that person ever existed in historical time is beside the point. So let's stop eliding the different forms of the real. Let's give the historical its due credit. Let's allow ourselves to become disillusioned, to be frank, about what we think actually happened. Let's allow us to grieve the death of God in the sense of a lack of resurrection of the physical body, a lack of miracles, a lack of the supernatural so conceived, a lack of the walking on water. Those are stories, and historically speaking, didn't happen. but we don't need them to have happened historically. They're stories and they're powerful and they speak to real, true things. And Jordan Peterson gets this, but is always equivocating on it. And every time he's pushed on it, he'll never just say, yeah, they didn't actually happen. He'll lean into, they're more true than true. They're more real than real. And that's true. And that is real. But they didn't actually happen. And to make the full metamodern move, you've got to sit with that. And you got to just accept that. You've got to own that moment of the dialectical unfolding of spirit and consciousness to deal with the move from the pre-modern to the modern disenchantment, and let that sink in and know what actually the death of God is like and the loss of enchantment and miracle and the supernatural. You've got to sit with that and then move beyond it. And until you sit with it, you can't move beyond it. And if you try to bypass it, it's not trans, it's pre. If you try to just get beyond it without actually having moved through it, you're going to have prematurely circumvented something essential, I think, to the faith journey. And obviously that's an option. And it's probably the more attractive option for the vast majority of people who I think are going to be inclined to just take the insights of postmodernity to allow them to keep living a traditional devotional perspective because modernity has problems. And then Jordan Hall, in my conversation with him, suggested that there is this historical argumentation for the validity of his particular form of faith. He talks about large number of people really believed that these stories happened, and that the evidence is very high by his standards, and that the accounts of the Gospels and their various miracles and whatnot are, he said, as likely to have occurred as Kennedy being assassinated or Pearl Harbor having happened. That's not true. That's just not the case, right? And I think we just have to be okay with that, right? Like, let's not try to bring in the historical. Let's let that one go. You can have the participatory, communal, phenomenological, and all those other aspects of the life of faith. You can have a relationship with the person of Christ. You can have all of that. You just don't have to say that it actually happened in historical time. And if we can just get past that hang up, then I think we'll have the openness of our conceptions so that a lot of the pathologies won't be as likely to show up in Christian spaces. What's that line? If you can make people believe absurdities, you can get them to do atrocities. We don't need to believe absurdities. We can say that this didn't happen, and we can live a religious, meaningful, spiritual life in deep relationship with the profound mystery and the Christ figure. And that's a very rich kind of metamodern Christianity that is, I think, something very profound and significant. And so it won't, I don't believe, happen until we can give up and submit on the issue of history. History is a modern man's game, and this stuff that we're talking about is beyond the modern, but it needs to include the modern. So let's include the modern, include the historical, not stop at the historical, but allow ourselves to live a life of mystery and profundity and a life of the spirit that doesn't get hung up with history. And then we won't have to be in denial. We won't have to repress. We won't have to feel threatened. The most radical deconstruction could be presented about the contents of your faith, and it doesn't matter, because actually you can affirm that radical deconstruction and say, yes, that's true. And I'll even go further than that and suggest that the true profound insight, the insight of Christianity that keeps giving gestures in this direction, that the cross and the death of God are always continually pointing to that deconstruction. And whatever allows you to keep showing up in that life of faith every day, despite that deconstruction, that is real faith. And that's the headless God that Hansi Freinacht talks about. The God that can be continually guillotined over and over again through critique and deconstruction and skepticism and doubt. and rise again on the third day. That's a God deserving of faith. And that's how I conceive of a metamodern Christianity's relationship to history and to the modern historical critical method. And it's why I keep harping on it, because this is the zone of proximal development for Christianity still at this moment, by and large, you know, is moving through the modern historical insights, allowing them to deconstruct the faith, and then ultimately receiving a kind of reconstructed faith on the other side of that, that is transhistorical, is the only way forward, I think, for reclaiming the power of the mythos of Christianity and its rich symbols and traditions and heritage and rituals, in a way that frees it and loosens it from the fetters of this binding backwards traditionalism that wants to view things literally and makes an idol of its conceptions about the divine. It doesn't let it see anything beyond its more parochial perspective, that has to silence and critique and attack those who would bring information to its perspective instead of opening wide arms to information and perspectives and insight. And a Christianity that's sufficiently metamodern is one that can hear all of that and still believe, because belief isn't predicated on history. It's about the transhistorical Christ of faith and not the historical Jesus. At this point, if I keep talking, I'll just wind up repeating myself. So I'll leave it there. Curious about your thoughts, reflections on this little set of insights, and feel free to comment, attack me in the comments, and let me know if you think that this is too radical, not sufficiently radical, what have you, metamodern or not, what have you. Love to know your how this lands with you. But till next time, Godspeed, everyone.